History is full of men who mistook a sprint for a marathon. Hitler believed his invisible jet wing, the Horten 229, would end the war in a single stroke. But while he was perfecting a ghost in a secret bunker, a sleeping giant was outbuilding him with an avalanche of steel. Today, we look at the moment Hitler realized that even a miracle weapon couldn't hide from the math of an industrial war. We often look back at the early 1940s and remember the sharp, terrifying crack of the Blitzkrieg. We remember the images of the Wehrmacht sweeping across Europe with a speed that seemed almost supernatural at the time. To the leaders in Berlin, it felt like they had finally cracked the code of modern warfare, that a superior will, combined with concentrated armor, could topple any nation before they even had time to lace up their boots. But there was a fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of the Nazi high command. They mistook a sprint for a marathon. You see, Hitler and his inner circle were obsessed with the idea of qualitative superiority. They believed that because they had the head start, the most disciplined soldiers, and the most frightening tanks on the immediate battlefield, the war was already won. They looked across the Atlantic and saw a nation they considered soft, a melting pot of jazz music, Hollywood movies, and a civilian population that hadn't seen a foreign invader on its soil in over a century. To the German high command, America wasn't a threat, it was a warehouse of refrigerators and washing machines. But here is the reality they failed to grasp. A factory that can make a Cadillac can make a Stuart tank. A company that can churn out thousands of vacuum cleaners can, with the right pressure, churn out the fuses for high-explosive shells. While Hitler was focusing on the mirage of his lightning-fast victories in Poland and France, he was ignoring the raw, terrifying math of American industrial potential. In 1940, as the Luftwaffe rained fire on London, the United States was technically at peace, yet its industrial output was already nearly double that of Germany. Many of us might remember the old stories of our fathers or grandfathers working those assembly lines. They weren't soldiers yet, but they were the gears of a machine that hadn't even shifted into second gear. The German error was thinking that the will of the Führer could overcome the laws of economics. Hitler's economy was a chaotic mess of competing fiefdoms where high-ranking officials bickered over steel quotas. Meanwhile, the American sleeping giant was beginning to stir under a singular, terrifyingly efficient goal. We didn't just have more factories, we had a different philosophy of making things. While a German engineer might spend 1,000 hours hand-finishing a single Tiger tank engine to perfection, a foreman in Flint, Michigan was figuring out how to stamp out 1,000 Sherman tank parts in a single afternoon. It was the difference between a craftsman and a titan. History suggests that wars aren't just won by the bravest men on the front lines, though we had those in spades. They are won by the person who can afford to lose 100 tanks today because they know 500 more are coming off the line tomorrow. Hitler looked at our 1930s bread lines and saw weakness. He failed to see that those same lines were full of the men who would soon build the arsenal of democracy at a scale the world had never seen and likely will never see again. The mirage was the belief that speed could defeat scale. But as the smoke cleared from the initial German victories, the horizon began to darken with the silhouette of American industry, a force that didn't just want to outfight the enemy, but intended to simply outbuild them until there was nowhere left for the swastika to hide. If you were to sit down with a high-ranking official in the Reichskanzlei in 1941, you would have encountered a very specific, very dangerous form of arrogance. To Adolf Hitler and his inner circle, men like Hermann Göring and Joseph Goebbels, the United States was a decadent, fractured society. They looked at our obsession with consumer goods, our burgeoning middle class, and our diverse population, and they saw a country that had lost its martial spirit. Hitler famously remarked that America was half Judaized, half Negrified, a country that excelled at making luxuries but lacked the soul to forge a sword. He looked at the massive Ford and General Motors plants and sneered, "The Americans only make refrigerators and Chevrolets." It was a fatal assumption that would eventually lead to the destruction of his empire. What Hitler failed to realize was that very things he mocked, the mass production of consumer goods, were exactly what made America the most dangerous opponent in history. You see, a nation that has mastered the art of putting a refrigerator in every home has already solved the hardest problem of warfare: mass production logistics. In Germany, the philosophy of manufacturing was still rooted in the 19th century Meister system. Each tank, each plane was treated almost like a piece of fine jewelry. They were over-engineered, hand-fitted, and required highly skilled labor at every step. This produced beautiful machines, but it was an incredibly slow way to build an army. In contrast, the American consumerist mindset meant we had spent the last 20 years perfecting the assembly line. We didn't care if a tank engine was a work of art. We cared if it was interchangeable. If a part broke on an American tank in the mud of Normandy, a mechanic could swap it out with a spare from a crate. If a part broke on a German Panther, it often had to be hand-filed or custom machined to fit. Hitler saw our mass-produced culture as soulless, but in reality, that soul was the terrifying efficiency of the American factory worker. There was also a deep-seated belief in Berlin that the American worker wouldn't or couldn't pivot to wartime production. They remembered the Great Depression and the labor strikes of the 1930s. They thought the American public was too soft for the sacrifices of war. But they forgot one thing: the American spirit of ingenuity. Many of us remember the stories of the dollar-a-year men, the CEOs and industrial titans who left their lucrative posts to head to Washington and coordinate the war effort for a salary of exactly $1. While Hitler's subordinates were fighting each other for influence, American industry was forming a unified front. By 1942, the refrigerator plants Hitler had mocked were performing miracles. General Motors, for instance, didn't just stop making cars. They became the largest provider of war materiel in the world. They produced everything from airplane engines to machine guns to amphibious ducks. In a single year, the American automobile industry produced more value in war goods than the entire German economy did in 3. In 1941, Germany produced roughly 3,700 tanks. In that same year, the United States, which hadn't even fully entered the war, produced nearly 4,000. By 1943, that number had jumped to nearly 30,000. Hitler believed that willpower could overcome these numbers. He thought that if his tanks were bigger and his soldiers were more fanatical, the math wouldn't matter. But as any veteran of the Pacific or European theaters will tell you, quantity has a quality all its own. When you can send 5 tanks for every one the enemy produces, and when you can replace your losses in a week while the enemy takes a month, the outcome is a foregone conclusion. The Führer's fatal assumption wasn't just a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. He couldn't imagine a world where decadent consumers could transform into the most efficient killers of tyranny in history. He saw the refrigerator, but he missed the massive high-voltage power grid that made it run. If you had walked through the streets of Detroit in early 1941, you would have heard the familiar sounds of a city in the middle of a boom. The rhythmic thud of the presses, the hiss of steam, and the chatter of thousands of workers heading into the plants of Chrysler, Ford, and Packard. At that moment, these men were building the dream of the American middle class. But just a few months later, the music changed. The Great Conversion didn't happen by accident. It was a deliberate, violent pivot of an entire civilization's energy. Many of us remember hearing about the day the music died for the American car. In February 1942, the United States government did something unthinkable. It banned the production of civilian automobiles. Imagine that for a moment. An entire industry, the backbone of the American economy, simply stopped. No more chrome bumpers, no more white wall tires, no more luxury sedans. But as those lines went silent, a new sound began to rise. It was the sound of Detroit becoming the graveyard of the Luftwaffe. Hitler had mocked our refrigerator factories, but he was about to learn that a factory designed to stamp out a fender every 30 seconds can be retooled to stamp out a wing spar just as quickly. The most staggering example of this conversion was Henry Ford's Willow Run plant. At the time, the aviation industry was a boutique business. Planes were built like yachts, slowly, by hand, in small hangars. Then came Ford. He looked at the B-24 Liberator bomber and didn't see a complex aerodynamic marvel. He saw a heavy piece of machinery that needed to be mass-produced. The experts in the aviation industry said it couldn't be done. They said you couldn't build a 4-engine bomber on an assembly line. Ford's response was to build the largest room in the world, a plant so vast it had its own weather system inside. At its peak, Willow Run was churning out one B-24 bomber every 60 minutes. Think about that. Every hour, 24 hours a day, a fresh Liberator rolled off the line, fueled up, and flew toward the front. To the German Luftwaffe, which was struggling to produce even a few dozen bombers a month due to complex designs and bureaucratic infighting, this wasn't just a military defeat, it was a mathematical impossibility. But it wasn't just about quantity, it was about the marriage of American production and Allied design. You may know the story of the P-51 Mustang, the plane that finally broke the back of the German air defense. In its early days, the Mustang was an okay fighter, but it lacked the power to fly high enough to escort our bombers. The solution was the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but the British couldn't build enough of them. Therefore, the blueprints were sent to the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit. The British engineers were horrified at first. They sent over blueprints that required hand-fitting and master-touch assembly. Packard's engineers looked at the plans, tore them apart, and redrew them so they could be built by thousands of American workers who had never seen an airplane engine in their lives. Packard didn't just build the Merlin, they built it better, faster, and more reliably than the original. That engine, mass-produced in a car factory, gave the Mustang the heart it needed to hunt the Luftwaffe out of the sky. We shouldn't forget the people behind these machines. The conversion wasn't just about retooling lathes, it was about retooling lives. This was the era of Rosie the Riveter, but it was also the era of the old hands. Men in their 60s and 70s, many of whom had retired, returned to the shops because they were the only ones who knew how to run the old heavy machinery. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in plants that were often unheated or dangerously loud. There was a sense of quiet, authoritative duty. They knew that for every bolt they tightened, a boy in a cockpit over Germany had a better chance of coming home. By 1943, the results of the Great Conversion were undeniable. The United States was producing over 85,000 aircraft a year. Germany, at its absolute peak, could barely manage 25,000, and many of those were outdated or lacked the fuel to fly. Hitler had anticipated a war of qualities where his elite pilots would duel with Allied amateurs, but Detroit turned the war into a battle of quantities. The sky over Europe didn't just contain better planes, it contained too many planes. The Luftwaffe was simply smothered by the sheer weight of American steel. The graveyard of the Luftwaffe wasn't a single battlefield, it was the assembly lines of Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Therefore, the German pilot, no matter how skilled, was no longer fighting a man in another cockpit. He was fighting the combined industrial output of the American middle class, and that was a fight he was never going to win. This brings us to one of the most persistent myths of the Second World War, the idea that German engineering was so superior that it should have won the day. We've all heard the stories of the Tiger tank, a steel monster so thick that American shells would bounce off its hide like pebbles and so powerful it could pick off our boys from 2 miles away. On paper, it was a masterpiece, but in the cold, hard reality of a global war, that quality became a trap that eventually snapped shut on the Third Reich. You see, the Germans approached tank building like they were making a fine Swiss watch. Every Tiger tank was practically a custom job. If you were a German mechanic in the field and you needed a replacement transmission, you couldn't just grab one from a warehouse and drop it in. Often, the parts had to be hand-filed or shimmed to fit that specific chassis. History suggests that Hitler's obsession with Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, was his undoing. He wanted the biggest guns, the thickest armor, and the most complex optics, but he forgot a rule that every one of us who has ever worked under the hood of a car knows. The more complex the machine, the more ways it has to break. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, but a nightmare of maintenance. It used an intricate system of overlapping road wheels. If the innermost wheel got a flat or was damaged by mud that froze overnight, the crew had to remove several other wheels just to get to the one that was broken. In the heat of battle, quality like that is a death sentence. Now, let's look at the American alternative, the M4 Sherman. If you put a Sherman up against a Tiger in a one-on-one duel on a flat field, the Sherman was in trouble. Our boys knew it, and they called them Ronsons because they were known to light up on the first hit. But the Sherman had a secret weapon that Hitler never respected: interchangeability. The Sherman was designed by people who understood the American assembly line. The parts were standardized. Whether a Sherman was built in a locomotive plant in Pennsylvania or an auto plant in Michigan, the bolts were the same, the tracks were the same, and the engines were modular. We didn't just build a tank, we built a system. If a Sherman was damaged, we didn't leave it on the side of the road to rust. We had recovery vehicles that would tow it back to a mobile repair unit. Because the parts were interchangeable, a mechanic could strip parts from 2 wrecked tanks and have a third one back in the fight by morning. For every Tiger the Germans managed to limp back to a factory in Essen, we had 10 Shermans being repaired right behind the front lines. There is a profound lesson here about the difference between the best and the most effective. The Germans spent their limited resources building a few hundred unbeatable machines. We spent our limitless resources building 50,000 good-enough machines. Many of us remember the old saying, "Quantity has a quality all its own." By 1944, the German quality trap was fully sprung. Their tanks were terrifying, yes, but they were also rare, fuel-hungry, and prone to mechanical breakdown. A Tiger tank that ran out of gas or through a track was just a very expensive pillbox. Meanwhile, the American industrial machine was drowning them in a sea of standardized steel. We could afford to lose 4 Shermans to knock out 1 Tiger because we had 4 more Shermans waiting in the woods and another 40 on a ship crossing the Atlantic. This quality trap extended to everything. The Germans had dozens of different types of trucks, each requiring different spare parts. The U.S. Army moved on the GMC 2.5-ton truck, the Deuce and a Half. We built over 500,000 of them. They were the unsung heroes of the war. Because they were all the same, our logistics officers didn't have to play a guessing game with spare parts. Hitler's engineers were artists, but our engineers were logisticians. They understood that a weapon is only as good as the supply chain that feeds it. While the Germans were boasting about the quality of their steel, we were busy perfecting the quality of our distribution. The result was a paradox. The more the Germans tried to engineer a way out of their predicament with complex new weapons, the more they strained their crumbling infrastructure. They were building masterpieces for a museum, while we were building tools for a job. In the early years of the war, it looked like Hitler might be right. In the happy time for German submariners, they were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than the British could possibly build them. It was a simple, brutal equation. If the rate of sinking exceeded the rate of building, the war was over. Britain would starve, and the arsenal of democracy would be landlocked and useless. But this is where the American industrial philosophy of interchangeability and mass production moved from the land to the sea. The United States Maritime Commission realized that to win the Battle of the Atlantic, we didn't need the most beautiful, sleek, or fast ships. We needed a tramp steamer that could be built by people who had never seen the ocean. Enter the Liberty ship. When President Roosevelt first saw the plans for these vessels, he reportedly called them dreadful-looking objects. They were slow, boxy, and lacked any of the grace of traditional shipbuilding. But they had one quality that mattered more than beauty. They were designed for the assembly line. Before the war, it took over 200 days to build a single cargo ship. That was the old way. hand-riveting millions of steel pins into place. American engineers, led by titans like Henry Kaiser, threw that manual out the window. They switched to electric welding. This allowed them to prefabricate massive sections of the ship, the bow, the stern, the deckhouse, in separate shops, and then simply crane them together for a final weld. The results were mathematically impossible to the German mind. The average construction time dropped from 200 days to 40, then to 30. One shipyard, in a feat of pure American bravado, built a ship called the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Hitler's U-boats were sinking one ship a day, but American shipyards were launching dozens. By 1943, we weren't just replacing what was lost, we were growing the fleet while under fire. Many of us remember the phrase, "logistics wins wars," but it's often spoken as if it's a dry academic concept. In reality, it was a battle of endurance. For every U-boat the Germans painstakingly built over 9 months, the U.S. was launching dozens of Liberty ships and specialized hunter-killer escort carriers. The Germans were fighting a war of attrition they couldn't win because their input was fixed, while the American input was exponential. We didn't just send ships, we sent the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines across the American continent to get oil to the coast, and then we sent combat-loaded transports that could unload a whole division's worth of gear in hours instead of days. There's a reason veterans of the Merchant Marine are held in such high regard by those who know the history. They sailed these ugly ducklings into the teeth of the most dangerous waters on Earth. But they did so knowing that behind them stood a production line that stretched from the docks of Richmond, California, all the way to the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Hitler had banked on the U-boat being a silver bullet that would sever the Allied jugular, but he forgot that a jugular is only vulnerable if it's the only vein. The American industrial machine created a circulatory system so vast and so redundant that even the loss of hundreds of ships couldn't stop the flow of blood to the front lines. By 1944, the U-boat menace hadn't just been defeated, it had been drowned by a literal wall of American merchant tonnage. The logistics of blood had proven that you can't win a war by destroying the enemy's supplies if the enemy can build a new supply ship faster than you can load a torpedo. By the time we reached the summer of 1944, the math of the war had moved from the ledger books of Washington and Berlin to the hedgerows of Normandy and the plains of Eastern Europe. For the German soldier, the experience of the war began to shift from a test of skill to a confrontation with a force of nature. It's one thing to read a report that the enemy outproduces you 5-1. It is quite another to live through the reality of what that means on the front lines. Who grew up in the shadow of this era remember the stories of the reckoning. It wasn't just that the Americans had more men, it was that every single American private had behind him the weight of 10 German industrial workers. In the German army, artillery was a precision tool. A battery commander would carefully calculate his shots, mindful of his limited shell supply. He had to make every round count because the train bringing his next shipment might have been bombed by a P-47 Thunderbolt days ago. For the American GI, artillery was a fire hose. We developed a system called time on target, where every available battery in a sector would coordinate their fire so that all shells landed at the exact same second. We could afford to do this because the 5-1 math meant our supply dumps were overflowing. German prisoners of war often remarked with a mix of horror and awe that the Americans didn't just fire at targets, they landscaped the battlefield. They would shell a single sniper's nest with the intensity the Germans used to level a city block. It was the industrialization of destruction. There's a specific detail that often gets lost in the Hollywood version of the war. The horses. Even in 1944, the modern German army still relied on nearly 3 million horses to move their supplies and artillery. When a German unit moved, it moved at the pace of a beast of burden. But when the American sleeping giant arrived, it didn't walk, it drove. Thanks to Detroit, the U.S. Army was the only fully motorized force in the world. We didn't just have tanks, we had trucks for the food, trucks for the mail, and trucks for the fuel to keep the other trucks moving. This created a pace of war that German high command couldn't comprehend. They would plan a counterattack based on how fast they thought a human being could march, only to find that an American armored division had already bypassed them, fueled by a constant stream of jerry cans, ironically an improved version of a German design, mass-produced by the millions in American stamping plants. The German soldier was fighting in 1918, the American soldier was fighting in 1945. The most heartbreaking part of the reckoning for the German side was the erosion of their elite status. A German pilot might have 100 kills, making him an undisputed ace, but he was flying a plane that had been patched together with scrap metal, using synthetic fuel that clogged his engine. He would go up against 5 American pilots. None of them had 100 kills. In fact, most of them were kids from Iowa or New Jersey who had only been flying for 6 months. But they were flying brand new aircraft. They had been trained in a massive, fuel-rich program in the States, and they had the confidence of knowing that if they were shot down, a new plane was already waiting for them on the tarmac. The 5-to-1 math meant that American mediocrity, supported by infinite resources, would always eventually crush German excellence that was starved of them. It was a cold, industrial attrition. You could be the best marksman in the world, but if the other guy has a machine gun and a mountain of ammunition, the math eventually wins. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the German reckoning turned into a psychological collapse. They realized that they weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a factory. There's a famous story of a German officer captured in 1945. He saw an American truck driver eating a piece of chocolate cake that had been mailed from his mother in Kansas just days ago. The officer broke down in tears. He realized that if the Americans had enough shipping capacity and fuel to send fresh cake across the Atlantic to a truck driver, Germany never had a chance. The war wasn't decided by the generals, it was decided by the postal service and the bakeries. The reckoning was the moment the current common belief in German superiority hit the contrarian reality of American industrial logistics. It was the point where the Führer's dreams of a 1,000-year empire were ground into the mud by a million sets of interchangeable gears. As we look back through the fog of 8 decades, it's easy to get swept up in the romanticism of the battlefield. We focus on the will of the soldier, the genius of the generals, and the ideological fervor that drove men to do the impossible. But when you strip away the propaganda and the Hollywood scores, you're left with the ghost of the assembly line, the quiet, undeniable truth that in the modern era, the most dangerous weapon a nation possesses isn't a silver-tongued orator or a secret weapon. It's a healthy balance sheet and a humming factory floor. Many of us remember the post-war years when those same factories that built the arsenal of democracy shifted back to making the cars and appliances that defined the American dream. We saw the prosperity firsthand. But we must never forget that this prosperity was the same force that broke the back of the most terrifying military machine the world had ever seen. The Nazis were obsessed with the concept of will, the idea that if a people wanted victory badly enough, they could bend reality to their desires. They believed that a master race could ignore the boring pedestrian laws of economics. Hitler truly thought that the sheer intensity of his ideology could make up for a 5-to-1 disadvantage in steel production. But history suggests that will is a finite resource. It burns hot and fast, but it eventually flickers out when the boots wear through and the stomachs go empty. Wealth, in the industrial sense, is different. Wealth is a multiplier. A nation with the wealth to build an automated infrastructure doesn't need its soldiers to be supermen. It just needs them to be well-equipped men. The ghost of the assembly line tells us that Hitler didn't lose because his soldiers weren't brave or because his tanks weren't thick. He lost because he picked a fight with a system that could afford to fail more often than he could afford to succeed. We often hear the phrase, "freedom isn't free," and we usually think of it in terms of lives lost. And while that sacrifice is sacred, there is another cost, the immense, staggering capital required to sustain liberty. The American victory was a triumph of the middle class, the same people who paid the taxes, bought the war bonds, and clocked in to the 4 a.m. shifts. This was the wealth that won the war, not just bags of gold in a vault, but the human capital of 1,000 skilled trades. It was the plumber who became a pipe fitter on a destroyer, the seamstress who began sewing parachutes, the shop teacher who taught a generation how to read a blueprint. For those of us who have seen the world change so drastically since 1945, there's a certain nostalgia in this realization. We lived through a time when America's strength was tangible. You could see it in the smoke rising from the Rust Belt and endless trains of freight moving across the plains. The lesson of the 5-to-1 math is a sobering reminder for the future. It warns us that a nation that neglects its industrial base, that forgets how to make things in favor of just moving numbers around, is a nation that is losing its arsenal. Hitler dismissed our factories as a source of decadent comfort, but those comforts were the training ground for the greatest logistical feat in human history. In the end, the war wasn't won by a single miracle weapon. It wasn't the atom bomb that defeated Germany. They had already collapsed under the weight of conventional steel before the first mushroom cloud rose in the desert. It was won by the relentless, rhythmic thud of the American press brake. It was won because when the chips were down, the American system proved that a free people working in a competitive industrial economy could outthink, outproduce, and outlast a command economy run by a tyrant. Wealth won. Not the wealth of the miser, but the wealth of the builder. As we sit here today, looking back at the mirage of the Blitz, we should take a moment to honor the ghosts of the assembly line. They are the ones who proved that while will might start a war, it's the factory that finishes it. The story of the American factory isn't just a chapter in a history book. For many of us, it's the story of our families and the values we were raised with. If you found value in this deep dive into the math of victory, I'd ask you to do two things. First, subscribe to this channel and join our growing community of folks who still believe that history and the truth behind it matters. We release these long-form documentaries regularly for an audience that prefers depth over clickbait. And second, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Did you or your family work in one of these arsenal of democracy plants? Your stories are the living tissue of this history, and they deserve to be heard. Thank you for your time and for helping us keep these memories alive.